Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Eli, and I'm the pastor here at Nickel City. I'm glad you're here with us today. Today is going to be an exciting day. I'm really excited for today because we are in a new series called Simplify Church. And it's been a fun series. I don't know about you, but I've been having fun with this series. And so I want to encourage you, if you have missed any weeks, you can catch up on them by watching the sermon on the Nickel City Church app. So if you go on the app, you can watch the past sermon, make sure you never miss a thing, and can stay connected with what's happening, even if you happen to be out of town a week or something. So this week, we're going to jump into the Simplify Church series by talking about worship. Now, worship is a topic that excites me. This is a topic that I get really excited about, and if you've been here for any amount of time, you know that when it comes to the topic of worship, that I tend to get pretty excitable as we talk about it, because I really believe in worship. I believe in the value of worship, and I've seen so many awesome things happen through worship. And so I wanted to have you guys not just hear it from me, because I talk about worship all the time, and I've preached about worship multiple times, but I wanted to invite these guys up because these guys have all been part of the worship team here at Nickel City. They are all part of making worship happen. And not only have they done it here, but they also are coming from different backgrounds and different places in their lives, some of them growing up in church and doing worship. And so I'm really excited for them to be a part of this, to share their perspective, because it's going to be a chance for you to not just hear my thoughts on worship, but get to hear the experience of these other guys here. So I just want to quickly introduce them. This is Phil. Next we have Zach, and then Maxwell, who introduced himself here earlier. And I'm really excited you guys are here on the panel today. This is something new that we're doing, but I'm excited to have you guys be a part of it. Now, before we jump into, we're going to talk today about 5 truths about worship. But before we jump into that, I just wanted to help us to get to know you guys a little bit more so if you can help us by answering this question of what made you want to get involved in worship in the first place?
Well, for me, that's kind of a two-parter, a two-part question, because first, it's not just what got me to want to be part of worship, but why I wanted to be part of a worship at Nickel City Church. So first off, for those who don't know about my past, I actually grew up in Toronto. My father has a church there. He's a pastor of a pretty prominent Indian church, and I've always been surrounded by church going. I mean, went to Wednesday night meetings, Friday night meetings, Saturday night meetings. Our lives revolved around the church. So naturally speaking, I would gravitate towards the church. But there's a big difference between going to the church to just go and actually being saved. And worship is where I felt that personal experience. Second, I naturally always wanted to play music because I play drums, I play bass, I play guitar, I play a lot of instruments. So music was a way for me to channel my talents towards serving God. And specifically when I came into Nickel City Church, my wife just moved here. I've always been in Buffalo, but we were going to Toronto full-time for church. I wanted to find a local church, and when I first walked in here, I was greeted by Eli's smiling face, and Maxwell, for that matter. And the minute worship started, even with just them two, and this proves that it's not just about the instruments that are played and not just about the music that is played, I felt the move of God, and that's what made me want to get involved in Nickel City Church.
Awesome. What about you, Zach?
Yeah, so for me, kind of along the same lines of Phil, I grew up in the church. My dad's a pastor. Every single thing I did was, church related. Woke up Sunday morning, went to church. Sunday night, went to church. Wednesday night, went to church. That was just something that I grew up doing. But along with that, my family, people would say, is very musically inclined. And so music has always just been a passion of me and my family. So there's been so many times that I grew up playing the drums for my church back at home, and it was more of a older version church, so we play a lot of hymns and stuff like that, and there's a lot of playing through the motions. But there's so many times that I'm listening to more modern music or anything like that I'm at a red light, and I'll hear the same song that I've heard like 1,000 times, 2,000 times. Like, I've heard the song, and just there's one line that just sticks out, and it just hits you so hard. And that's why I find there's a correlation between like the strong, like what the Bible says, and worship, because you can hear the same song so many times, and that one other time that you hear it, it's just going to hit you completely differently. And so with my love for music and everything that I do music-wise, along, like Phil said, he plays so many instruments. I play drums, piano, guitar. Like I play a handful of instruments. I knew that God pushed me to the point of sharing my love for God through something else that I love, which is music. And music is just you can do so much stuff with it. And so I knew that when I came here, and same thing with Phil, we kind of came at different times of not seeing each other, but it was just Max and Eli. And I knew, I was like, he was on my heart. He's like, you want to get up there, talk to him about it. And so I knew, I was like, I might as well do it. And so I talked to them, and here I am, just doing what I do.
Yeah. Awesome. What about you, Maxwell? What has made you want to get involved in worship?
Well, I mean, specifically here, I saw a huge need. And I mean, we talked about it when I first joined the church, but I've kind of led worship now for a couple years. When I was living in New Mexico, it's where I got started. I've been playing music for a really long time. Can you turn this down just a little bit? Thanks. I've been playing music for a really long time, and so when I first went to church, the first time in my life, I was 19 years old, and it was worship that really shook me out of the delusion, I guess, I was in before that. And it was mostly just because I had such a passion and a connection with music that when hearing someone genuinely celebrating this God that I didn't know, it just hit right at home. And I will say, as far as Bible study and things like that, as I slowly grew as a Christian and started learning more about the truths about God, worship just kind of became a natural response for me. It just felt like that's exactly what I should be doing. I mean, this guy's amazing. He's incredible. And so I started to learn more and more about God, not only through study, but through celebrating him, and just decided to channel the same thing, put my talents to use. And I remember last summer, I came in, met Eli, shining, smiley face. He was like, hey man, we're so glad you're here. I loved it. It was awesome. So I just stuck around. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Well, we're glad that you guys are a part of it. Aren't you guys appreciative that we have guys who are, yeah, you can give it up for them. Them and some others on the team who come in, they practice every week. They work together really well to try to give the best musical kind of experience, and they work hard at doing it. So we're glad that you guys are here and a part of this. And so today we're going to dive into this idea of 5 truths about worship. And I'm really excited we're just going to dive right in. You guys ready? Let's dive in. The first truth that we're going to talk about is that worship is a lifestyle. Worship is a lifestyle. I think oftentimes we think about worship and we think about it on a Sunday morning, right? We come in on a Sunday and it is time for worship. Hey, let's stand and let's go into a time of worship. And maybe you stand there and maybe you kind of listen to the music. Maybe you tap your toe a little bit and you're like, okay. Maybe you sing along. You can see the words on the screen, and maybe you think to yourself, well, this is nice. This is a nice, enjoyable experience. But I think that as we dig deeper into worship, we see that it isn't a passive thing. That worship isn't just something that we observe, but it's something that we actually do. It's an active thing that we do in our lives. And so this idea that worship is a lifestyle, I wanted to ask you guys, what examples do we see in the Bible that kind of prove that fact, that worship is a lifestyle?
Well, we see a lot of examples throughout the Bible, and some dealing with just praise and worship in terms of singing, some in terms of just following simple commandments of Jesus, and for God for that matter. For example, David is shown to be praising and singing after winning a great battle. Paul is praying inside of prison when he is locked in by the Romans. He is praying to God as a form of worship. And Abraham, there's a story where Abraham was called to sacrifice his son Isaac. Many may not see that as worship, but obedience is a form of worship. Following the commandments of God and following it to what he is calling you to do, that is a form of worship, and that's why it's more than just singing, it's a lifestyle.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, same thing. I've seen a lot of examples. A couple of my favorite ones, if you guys haven't checked them out, are Hosea. That's a really incredible story of devotion to God. He's a prophet that was called to just a radical testimony and a radical prophecy through his life. just to represent how Israel had been unfaithful to God. And so that's a really cool story. But the one that I always loved was Daniel. You guys might know, but in Daniel chapter 3, there's a story of King Nebuchadnezzar, and he orders a decree to all the people, and they are required to bow down and worship before this giant gold statue of himself. And Daniel and two other people, their names are really Shadrach something and Abednego. Thank you. It's a team effort. So they're the only three people in the whole kingdom, if you will, that refuse to do it. And I remember there's also a story too in there where Daniel, he purposefully leaves his window open in his second story room and prays audibly to God and just celebrates him, worships him. And that bravery, that devotion to God is just another example of how it's not just a song, it's not just singing, it's an act of your life. It's the way you live out your response to God.
I think it's such a cool thing because in all of these stories, and as we look at stories in the Bible, we don't see that God does miracles in people's lives and then they go, okay, well, let me wait till the Sabbath. Let me wait till Sunday morning to go to the temple so I can thank God and I can worship him. Right? We see them do it right in the moment. They begin praising God and worshiping him. And the story of David actually is a funny one to me because David is so excited about God's faithfulness and God's victory. He starts dancing, and he dances so much that literally his clothes fall off. And everyone's like, David, what are you doing? He's like, I don't care. God is so good. And so he just keeps worshiping God in the midst of everything that's happening. And I think it's a really cool example because it's true of our lives too. When God does things in our lives on throughout the week and in our daily lives, it's not something that we just hold on to and say, well, let me wait till Sunday morning until I can go and thank him, until I can go and worship him. Worship is a lifestyle. It happens with all the things that we do, with our attitudes, with our obedience, with thanking him and just singing to him and just praying, and all of these different things are acts of worship. And so the idea is that worship isn't just a moment, but it's a lifestyle, and it requires us to be active. And it kind of brings us into the second truth that we're going to talk about worship. It's that worship isn't about us. Now, I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to worship. I think that a lot of times we think of worship in the same category as everything else in the church, right? We have a message, and that's for us to take home to kind of think, to learn. We do announcements. Announcements are for us to know what's going on inside the church, right? The cafe is there for us to go and get some pastries and get some coffee and kind of get our morning energy. But the interesting thing about worship is this time of worship that we always start off with, it's not actually about us. It's the one thing that we do in church that's not about us at all. See, worship is about God, and it's about us focusing on who God is. That kind of shifts our perspective a little bit of worship, because I think that sometimes we have an idea to kind of come in and say, well, I don't really feel like worshiping today, or I don't really like the song that we're doing, or I don't really like the style of music that we're playing, or I don't really like when this particular person leads, and so I don't really feel like worshiping. But when we recognize that worship isn't about us and our feelings, we recognize that worship is about God, and that's its sole purpose. It actually changes us a lot. And so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about, if worship is for God, why is it important to him? Why is it important to God that we worship?
Well, simply put, it's important to worship God because he's worthy of it. I mean, he created all of us. He's with us with everything that we do. He shows us favor in everything that we do. In our joy, he's with us. He's the reason why we're happy. Even in our sorrow, because things could be a whole lot worse. God is with us with everything. And think about it, in everyday life, it's so easy for all of us to worship so many other things. We may not say it like that, but a lot of us worship the Bills. A lot of us love sports. A lot of us worship the Goo Goo Dolls, just shouting out my Buffalo people. But God calls us to worship him. He calls us to focus our eyes on him.
Yeah.
Yeah, so go on with that is that it also shows where your heart is. So worship is very important to God because, in a time of struggle, in a time of need, and anything, like it's such a simple task to just close your eyes and just look up to God and be like, help me out. And we talked about how like worship it's not just playing music. It's just those simple times that you're praying. That's another form of worship. So it shows where our heart is, and like in a time of struggle that we don't go and we don't start doing things that we shouldn't be doing. We look up to God and we're like, we're like struggling right now. We just need your help. And that's why it's important to him to show that we actually care. And so I grew up in the church. My dad, when he was younger, they were doing worship in his church, and he's singing a song, just a typical Sunday. He's singing a worship song, and a guy, he said, I've never talked to the guy before, but he was sitting next to me. So the guy leaned over, tapped him on the shoulder, and said, "Do you mean what you're singing?" And my dad said at that point, it really hit him hard that, we're worshiping not to sing the song, or we're not praying to, just have a conversation. We're worshiping to God because we love him, and like Phil said, like he deserves it. He's done so much for us, and that we need to give back to him, and that's the least we could do to give back to him.
Yeah, and I love that. I love that idea that he really is worthy. I mean, we sing that a lot, but it's a reality just as much as it is a way to celebrate it. I think the one of the other main points of worship, why it'd be important to him, because he wants us to know who he is. I mean, and he, just by thanking him, just by celebrating him, whether it's just a simple declaration, a prayer, an act of obedience, a song, whatever it is, that focus of attention on this incredible God who is real, alive, and active, it dissolves all of your cares, it dissolves all your worries, and you get to just a glimpse, like a deeper glimpse of who he is, and get to see that. And I think that's awesome. And he wants us to have peace. That's one thing Jesus promised us before he left. He wants us to have peace. So he invites us into worship because he knows that it's value for us too.
Yeah, I think that's such a key point. Worship really does bring our perspective, doesn't it? Sometimes when we're focusing on us and our situations, it can be really difficult to get through it. But when we focus on who God is, it really does have benefit to us. But before we get into that, isn't it just like God that he wants us to know him? Right? We talked about that when we talked about the Bible. We said that he gave us the very best that he had so that we could know who he is. And that's his desire for us. So as we worship, and it's important to God that we worship because he desires for us to know him. And so it's such a really cool thing that worship isn't about us. It takes some of the pressure off of our preferences and our likes, and it shifts our perspective to know that worship is about God, and he is worthy, and he does care for us, but it's because of who he is that he really deserves to be worshiped. That brings us into our third truth about worship, and that's that worship benefits us. So even though worship isn't about us, right, that was our last truth, worship isn't about us, that's true, but it does still benefit us. And this is really cool, because God is just awesome in this way. That as we follow along in the principles of God, as we follow along in his plans and purpose, things start to work out in our lives. And it pleases him. It makes him happy when we're obedient to him. But he's happy because he wants the best for us, because he desires the very best for our lives. And so even though worship isn't about us, it still has great benefits to us in our lives. And so I wanted to ask you guys today, there's probably a lot of things. I know we've talked through some of them, but maybe just share a little bit about how worship has impacted your life personally.
Well, and I mean, it kind of changes every day. That's what's really cool about worship is like for one day, it could just be an opportunity to make me even happier than I was that day. One day it could be that I'm frustrated. I'm just struggling to find hope, and it provides a sense of relief and encouragement to me. But I will say probably the biggest impact, it was the starting point of my walk with Christ. I mean, I loved music. I saw the passion of these people up on stage that were just laying it all on the line, no shame, no fear, no doubt, and just pouring their heart out to God. And for me, that was inspiring. And I was curious. I was like, who is this God that brings random people off the street together to do this together? And there's no shame. There's no judgment. They're just one big old happy family. That was probably the biggest impact for me.
Awesome.
Yeah, so worship impacted my life. It's kind of with the whole thing that I said before. Like it's very passionate for me. Like I love music. I love everything about it. And so being able to show that in a way of worship is just, it's amazing. And I remember a very specific time that I was going through something real. I was just kind of struggling. I mean, there's a lot bigger things in the world, but it was just one of those times that I was struggling personally. And I thought to myself, I'm like, I just don't know what to do. Like I could pray, but I've been praying a lot. And so it was a moment of my life where I'm like, praying is not getting me anywhere, and that's just kind of a lie that the devil seeps into your mind, and you just kind of start to believe it the more you think about it. And so I was like, I'll just put on music and I'll just kind of have a quiet time. And I put on a song, and the song that popped up was Call Upon the Lord. I just hit shuffle play, and that's what popped up. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, why? And so I was like, all right. So then I listened to the song, I paused it, and I prayed, and it was just like, it's such a huge ease, such a burden off my back. And like, it wasn't settled right then and there, but it was the comfort of knowing that at some point it will be settled. Through life, you're gonna have struggles, and it's okay to have those struggles. But in times like that, call upon the Lord. So that's how it impacted my life, that it's such an easy thing to turn to in a time of struggle.
And I love that because that's kind of goes along the line of perspective, right? When we're having hard times, when we're going through struggles, worship has a way, when we focus on God, it really has a benefit in our lives where our problems, they don't go away. Doesn't mean that our problems go away. I wish that was the case. I wish I could sit here and tell you, hey, when you worship, every problem in your life goes away. But we know that's not the case. But God can speak wisdom and life into your situation and give you perspective that you didn't have before. And that's a really cool thing. I'll just share mine, and then we'll ask you, Phil. I feel like for me, worship has benefited my life personally because I feel like God has spoken to me specific things through worship. Things that I might not have even been asking to know. Be praying and asking God or just worshiping and just singing the words, and all of a sudden I would feel the Holy Spirit speak to me a very specific thing in my life. And so I think that worship for me has become kind of a conduit to enter into God's presence and to really focus on God and really to listen to what he's saying. And so worship has benefited my life in many ways. And what about you, Phil? How has worship benefited your life personally?
Well, going off of what all of them have said, and to contrast kind of where Maxwell was coming from, I mean, I grew up in the church, like I said. I went through the motions. I was on the worship team. I played music. I sat for the sermons. But worship is where I truly felt the heart of God. I was saved through worship. It wasn't just listening to a sermon and then I put up my hands and said I wanted to pray and give my life to the Lord. It's that God used worship to reach out to me. Worship is a place where you can feel him move through you. There's no one in between. There's not a pastor who's giving a sermon, who's helping you get saved. It's not a worship leader who's up here saying, please give your life to the Lord. It's God reaching out to you himself and grabbing you himself because he wants you.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it is true. It becomes an intimate thing with God. Sometimes, a sermon is great. I preach a sermon every week, so we know that I value messages and sermons, but there is something about hearing from God, and it's this intimate thing that worship creates, this atmosphere where we can really hear from God for ourselves. And it's not just information, but it's God speaking to us very specific things. And I love what you said, Phil, that as you learned worship more, right? Maybe it started with a passion for music, but as you really started learning more about worship and worshiping more, you began to have a passion for worship. And that kind of brings us into our next truth that we're going to talk about. And it's that true worship comes from knowing God. True worship comes from knowing God. And this is really the basis of what everything here is built off of here at Nickel City. See, we believe that true worship comes from knowing God. And as we know God more, as we begin to recognize who he is, and as we begin to see who he is for ourselves, the more we naturally will want to worship him. See, we say that God is good. We say that God is perfect. We say that God is holy and so good to us. And as we start to recognize who he is, our hearts naturally turn towards worship. And so I love this idea that it comes from actually knowing God, but it kind of brings us to a little bit of an impasse here, because if true worship comes from knowing God, then it brings us to this question. Why don't we just jump straight into the sermon where we're talking about God? Why don't we just read the Bible every time we get together? Why is there music and why is there songs as a part of worship, and what benefit do they have in helping us to know God?
That's a good question. Sure. I mean, so I personally believe that even if you want to look at it as like a historical thing, it's mainly because it's been around since the early church. Even before Jesus, music existed, and it was a way people, even David sang songs, he wrote songs. The Psalms, most of them are written by him. So we can put it historically, but I actually want to even take it a step further, though. I was thinking about this the other day when we talked, and this analogy came to my mind. I got this kind of idea. So if praising God and worshiping him, the best way to do it was to put a boat on the water, right? Don't you think that we would start building really, really elaborate vessels so that we could carry hundreds of people together on these boats? Because being on the water on a boat meant you were honoring God. That meant you're praising him, you're celebrating him. If that's the case, music does that same thing essentially. It brings people together to accomplish a common goal and levels the playing field, if you will. It eliminates the distractions and turns the attention to God. That's the way I kind of saw it.
What about you guys? What do you think? Why would you say that we do songs as part of worship?
I would say that there's a big emotional power to music. It invokes very powerful emotions amongst people. So that's number one for me. And number two, it's going off of what Maxwell was saying, where God calls us all to be a church. And when he calls us to be a church, he calls us to worship together. And when music is being played, it is so much easier to sing in unison to him, congregationally. When we worship together, we will see the power of God move. And that's why I feel like music is such an important part to every service, because it helps us focus on him, helps us turn our emotions towards him rather than the distractions around us, like Maxwell was saying, and it helps us worship as one.
So the unity factor, I love that.
Right. So along with the unity factor of everyone coming together, I mean, you think in terms of, you go to a party, you go to an outing or something like that, what's usually in the background is music. So I find that music is also a way to celebrate what God has done for us. And instead of just jumping into the sermon, we take a moment, even though the sermon is another form of celebration and worship, the music in itself is kind of everyone together, celebrating together, singing together, how David was dancing. Yeah, David was dancing and his clothes fell off, He was by himself.
Let's not do that here.
Yeah,
just
let's not
for
do that
reference,
here. No,
right?
no.
Let's try to keep all articles of clothing on as we worship.
Yeah, but he was celebrating, and it's just another form to celebrate what he has done for us. And so it's an easy way to celebrate and then open our hearts. So once we're kind of together and, like Phil said, in unison, it's easier to take more in of the lesson that follows after that.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. And for me, I think the reason why I would say that we use songs and that is part of worship is that these songs that we're singing, they point to who God is. How many of you have ever got a song stuck in your head before? All right, you know that it can be a pretty powerful thing. Well, I've had songs stuck in my head from worship, and especially, we're getting together, we're practicing these songs, and so I'll have some of these songs stuck in my head for forever, the whole week, and my mind will just go there, and I'll just start singing it, and I find myself remembering who God is, that as I'm singing these songs, and as these songs that we sing here on Sunday are sticking with me, I find myself singing about who God is, and remembering who God is. And in the hard times in life, or even in the times when I just want to be selfish, I'm starting to remember, and it's starting to shift my perspective. And so music is such a powerful tool that we can use to help us to get our hearts to a place of worship by remembering who God is and the fact that these songs point us towards God. We're going to get ready to close up here. This is going to be our last point, but the last truth that we're going to talk about worship is that worship matters. Worship matters. You know, it's not just an extra or a filler. It's not something that we just do because it's nice to break up people talking. Worship is an important part of what we do here at Nickel City. And I wanted to ask you guys, why do you think that is? Why do we start off with worship, and why is that something that we do every single week? Why do we start with worship before we do other things here?
So, kind of along what I said before, is that like to start off with worship not only brings us into unison, but when we play our music, if you notice that we kind of play faster tempo songs, then we kind of slow it down near the end. And because we want to take those moments near the end to just really let you use that as a devotion time. Really just, you see people all the time close their eyes, open their hands, and really just open themselves up to God and what he has to offer. And so I believe that when we do that, the reason why we start is because once we close our eyes, once we open our hearts and open our hands and really single ourselves and kind of try and put ourselves in front of God to the point that we're looking face to face, it allows us to receive a lot more information and be more open-minded to what he has to say to us.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you guys think? Why do we start off with worship?
Honestly, it's based on what we said before. It's there to eliminate distractions. When you first come in, it's focusing you up on God. It's to start putting our eyes upward and to start putting all of our focus and all of our devotion towards him. And like Zach was saying, there's a reason why worship is structured the way it is. To come in with like something upbeat and happy and fast is in order to draw your attention in and draw your focus towards him. But as we near the end of worship is to enter a time of devotion, is to enter a time of pouring out our hearts and souls to him so we can feel connected to him and we can feel what he wants for us in our lives.
I agree completely. I mean, and really going alongside like the eliminating distractions piece, we all go through life, we know. I mean, behind the scenes too, we're always trying to encourage each other and going through real stuff together, and that's one thing we really value here at Nickel City is being unified and doing life with Christ. And I will say there are plenty of weeks where, even us, we're carrying stuff into this building, and so I see worship too. It's actually crucial for a successful church, because if you don't have the opportunity to really remember and recount the things that God has done in your life and celebrate them, you won't get the chance to let go of the things that distract you from him and the miracles he has planned. Yeah.
That's awesome. And it does so much, but I think that really hits the heart of it, right? So we all come in with life. We all have hardships. We all have distractions, even if it's not bad things. How many of you have ever been distracted in life because you're juggling a bunch of different things in life? I have 2 kids and one on the way, and I feel like a lot of times I'm trying to keep all the balls in the air and try to manage it. When we come in and worship, it takes all of those things away and says, focus on a singular thing. Focus on who God is. And as we do that, it kind of prepares our hearts for what he wants to do. It gives us a chance for him to speak to us. It gives a chance for him to kind of breathe life into those situations. The Bible tells us in the 10 Commandments that the Sabbath, that we're supposed to take one day a week to do 2 things, to rest. But the first thing is to worship and to rest. And I think they're closely correlated. That as we worship, it can bring rest to those other areas of our lives. And so I love that we start with worship. I think it's an important part. And I would encourage you, because church has a little bit of a habit, right? A lot of churches where people kind of start off worship and the seats are kind of empty. But by the end of worship, they get a little bit more full. And by the message, they're full. But I'd encourage you guys that worship is valuable, worship matters. I'd encourage you to get here and be excited and be anxious to worship, because there's a lot of good things that can happen. And ultimately, worship is a big part. It's not just a filler, it's not just an extra, but it's a key role to what is happening here at the church and what God wants to do. It happens through worship a lot of times. So just in closing, as we get ready to close, just closing remarks, why does worship matter? Just if you can give us one sentence, why does worship matter? Why should it matter to our lives?
Because it shows that our God is not an idol that sits idle, but he's a God who's alive.
Yeah.
I would say the same thing that Phil said. It matters because he deserves it. And, you know, if you work for something consistently and you push for something and you don't get anything in return, you know, like, what are you working for? So if God's working, continuing to help us grow, continues to help us go through our life, you know, he deserves the worship back. He deserves the honor back. And that's why I would say it's very important.
Definitely.
And I mean, the top two reasons I would say is because it helps us grow, and it, at the foundation of it too, it's our purpose. It's what we're made for.
Yeah.
So
That's awesome. All of those are valid reasons. And do you see why I'm excited to have these guys up here today? Because you aren't just hearing it from my mouth. I can sit here and tell you, hey guys, worship is important, worship is important. But you've heard three different perspectives other than mine of why worship matters and what it does in our lives. And for me, I would say, I'd sum it all up to this, that worship should matter to us because it matters to God, right? God tells us that we should love one another. And so we say, okay, well, we should love one another. We should work towards that. We should love one another better. Well, in the Bible, if you look at how many times God commands people to worship and he encourages them, hey, listen, shout out to me, worship. So for no other purpose, forget all the benefits, forget all of the other points, worship should matter to us because it matters to God. And if it matters to God, we should make it a priority in our lives. And so what we're going to do is we're going to get ready to close out, and we're just going to end with one more song of worship. I think it's a really fitting thing that we do because worship is important. I want to encourage you guys. Worship can change your life. God can speak to you through worship. God can do a lot of cool things in your life. And so I would encourage you to make worship a priority, to make it something that matters to you. And as we go into this last song, as we get ready to close out in worship, let this be the start of something in your life. Let it be the start of your attitude saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to make worship a priority. I'm going to make it matter to me. And watch what happens, because even though worship isn't about us, it really does benefit in our lives. And so we'll just get ready to close out here with worship, and I'll come back out and we'll pray as we close. But I'd encourage you, let's stand together and let's go into one more time of worship.
a lot of moving around today. Sorry, guys. And listen, you know, I have to say, just really try and think about that. Think about the fact that worship really matters to God, and He's not like some needy, attention deprived God. He wants us to know Him. Because He knows that when we look at Him, when we just get to even those little glimpses, those little winks and little chances to see who He is, see His nature, He knows our confidence will grow, our trust will grow, our love will just abound for each other, and we'll be unified in this new life through Christ. So as we sing this last song, just let that be on your heart right now.
to Calvary, where Jesus bled and died for me. I see his wounds, his hands, his feet, my Savior on that cursed tree. His body bound and drenched in tears, they laid him down in Joseph's tomb, the ancient seal by heavy stone, Messiah still and all alone. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. Oh Lord our God. And then on the third, at break of dawn, the Son of Heaven rose again. No triple dawn, where is your sting? The angels roar for Christ our King. Let's sing, oh praise him. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. Oh Lord our God. He shall return in rows of white. The blazing sun shall pierce the night, and I will rise among the saints, my gaze transfixed on Jesus' face. Let's just sing that one more time. He shall return in rows of white. The blazing sun shall pierce the night, and I will rise among the saints, my gaze transfixed on Jesus' face. Oh, praise. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise
something that happens as we worship. Even if you don't know the song well, even if you don't know all the words, as we look at these words and we see the life of Jesus written down here, it has the power to change us. It has the power to transform our thoughts, to transform our circumstances. So I just want to encourage you guys, let's be a church that worships. Let's put a priority in it on our lives. Let's make it a lifestyle, knowing it's not just something that happens on Sunday. But when God does things in your life, thank Him, praise Him right there in the moment. Let's remember, He's so good to us, and there's so many reasons that we have to worship Him. Guys, as we get ready to close, I just would ask if you'll just pray with me. God, we thank you for who you are, God. God, that you're good, that you're powerful and strong and mighty. God, that you are alive and that you're active, that you are still watching over us and caring for us today. God, I pray that you would help us to focus on you. God, let our hearts be turned for worship. God, let our hearts be turned towards you. God, in everything that we do, let us be worshipers. Let it be a lifestyle of worship. God, I pray that you would not let us just be passive in our praise towards you, God, but let us recognize that you are the source of everything good. God, and let our hearts be turned towards you in worship because you are worthy of it. God, help us to prioritize worship because it's important to you. So let it be important to us. We thank you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Guys, I want to invite you out Wednesday night. We're going to be continuing our Simplify Connect group. And we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be doing a round circle kind of worship night. And so I really want to encourage you to come out. It's going to be an acoustic, unplugged kind of thing. But it's going to be a great chance for us to put this into practice, for our lives to be that of worshipers and to come together as a group and be unified. So I'd encourage you Wednesday night right here at 6:30. So we hope to see you there, guys. We're glad you were part of this today panel. We thank you guys for being up here. And yeah, you can give it up for them one more time. We're glad you were part of this. Thanks for sharing your perspective. And we will see you guys here a little bit later.